Hello and welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. Today's episode considers Far Cry 2, published by Ubisoft in 2008. Far Cry 2 takes place in a fictional Central African state undergoing a civil war. Conflict features two warring factions. The two sides are supplied by an American arms dealer named the Jackal. The player character's mission is to find and kill the Jackal, presumably to stop the war. The player character is a foreign mercenary, and in their pursuit of the Jackal, they can take up side missions including assassination, arms trading, and seek and destroy missions. Since its release in 2008, Far Cry 2 has become something of a critical darling among game journalists and scholars. This is thanks in large part to the game's mechanics, which emphasizes an immersion through a lack of persistent game HUD, and by forcing the player to deal with problems not typically seen in first-person shooters, including weapon jamming and injury management. Similarly, the game is celebrated for its open world, which allows for moments of emergent gameplay and storytelling thanks to the dynamics of enemy AI, as well as the in-game environment. Despite the game's reputation, critics very rarely consider Far Cry 2's setting, and in particular, the nature of post-colonial conflict in Africa. In order to delve into the setting, I've invited Professor Charlie Thomas onto the show. Charlie is an associate professor and department chair for strategy and security studies for the United States Air Force's Air Command and Staff College. Prior to this post, he held an appointment in the International Division of the Department of History at West Point. He is an African historian who received his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin and has written extensively on East African history, civil-military relations on the continent, and the social construction of African militaries. Charlie is also the managing editor of the Journal of African Military History, a journal which he helped to found. Charlie, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bob. It's fantastic to be here. I was excited when this game first came out. I'm excited to actually have you host me and to be able to talk about this. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the kind introduction.
Great, yeah. And I know that you've got a statement that you've got to read out to our listeners.
I do, and it is not certainly a hostage sort of situation, but because of, as you noted in your kind introduction, I do work for the United States Department of Defense for the Air Force, and as such, in this case, I have to offer the following disclaimer. The opinions and discussion that I'm about to offer are mine and mine alone, and they do not reflect the official policy or beliefs of the Department of Defense, the United States Air Force, or even the United States government as a whole. To put simply, these are my opinions and my opinions alone.
All right. Well, hostage situation averted. Thank you for that disclaimer.
Hooray.
And I'll just jump into the questions here. So Far Cry 2 is set in 2008 in a Central African state undergoing a civil war. This civil war is marked by endemic, inescapable violence, is fed by the presence of arms dealers, foreign mercenaries, diamond smuggling, and a lack of intervention by the international community. This representation of turmoil certainly fits in with the popular Western imagination regarding post-colonial Africa. But I'm wondering what you make of this depiction. Do these sorts of depictions have it right, or are they part of a larger problem of misrepresenting life in post-colonial Africa?
I'm going to give a very, very stereotypical academic answer where it's honestly yes and no to a degree. Now, in terms of the actual conflict that we're seeing here with the various elements that you've listed, like we have absolutely seen post-colonial conflicts that fit these parameters. In fact, if one was to actually just take this game and really kind of scrub the actual names that are given, this would fit almost archetypically into kind of the ragged wars that happened in the civil wars in Liberia, which began in 1989, and then in Sierra Leone. And with both of these, they featured basically every one of these elements. Sierra Leone specifically had diamond smuggling. You see popular depiction of that in the movie Blood Diamond. That's actually set in the Sierra Leone Civil War. In Liberia, whereas there's really not a diamond market, there's a lot of discussion about the role of Firestone and the rubber plantations that were there. And these really were these very chaotic conflicts that we're seeing here, where there's sort of an entire breakdown of state control. In fact, in the Sierra Leone Civil War, you actually see the coining of a term called Sobels, Sobels, which is a portmanteau of soldiers and rebels, where you actually have the soldiers who initially had been fighting the rebels sort of joining them or making common cause at times and becoming an independent actor on their own. And so you really do see this continuing endemic violence. You see sort of this chaos and sort of this almost loss of kind of greater political goals from the violence in many cases. And you'll also see elements of some of these same elements, although not in such a complete package, in other conflicts that happened in the post-colonial era and the post-Cold War era in Africa. The Somali civil wars, which began in 1991 with the collapse of the Siad Barre government, which most Americans will mostly know through the movie Black Hawk Down, features a lot of these. You have elements of this that also pop up in the two Congo wars, one which lasts 96 to 97, the other one which is 1998 to 2003, which I'll revisit later in our discussion. With each of these, you have pieces of this. And so the thing is these sort of, at least the depiction as it's shown, certainly has resonance. These conflicts have occurred. They, in many cases, do have these elements. Now, this is where we actually get into the no portion, and there's several sort of layers of peeling back on how this is part of the larger problem of misrepresenting life in post-colonial Africa. The first, and this is just me picking, kind of being a nitpicking scholar, is that whereas, yes, we do have these sort of larger, chaotic, collapsing state conflicts on the continent, these are honestly very, very much just in terms of the actual conflicts, a distinct subcategory. There are interstate conflicts. There are regular militaries that behave in regular military behavior and that sort of thing. But really, if we want to look at this in setting that aside and looking at this more holistically as an educator on Africa, this is definitely part of the larger problem of misrepresenting life in post-colonial Africa, in that Africa itself is, well, there's a joke amongst Africanists that Africa is a country. As it tends to be represented to the broader world, there's just a continent with no borders, and one event happening there is happening everywhere. And there's no differentiation whether you're talking about Guinea or South Africa. And honestly, this is the heart of much of the misrepresentation, in that this, just to begin with, this is a massive continent. Given just land mass alone, you can fit, depending on how you divide them up, anywhere from 3 to 5 of the other continents within the land mass of Africa. Yeah. It has half a dozen different climatic zones. You know, if you actually look at sort of the cultural and social structures that exist across the continent, it's just a massive amount of diversity. The issue is what tends to break through the popular imagination, whether in news reports that we get on what's going on in Africa, or in popular depictions, again, Blood Diamond, Black Hawk Down, and the like. This is the depiction we're given. Honestly, if those are the stories being told, it's hard to blame folks for thinking that this is an undifferentiated, endemically violent, area. But these are very, very specific, regional, and in fact, oftentimes constrained within a single state or slightly crossing state borders, conflicts that are happening in very distinct contexts in very distinct portions of time. At the same time that you have, say, for example, the Congo wars going on, you have approximately 80% of the continent that is experiencing worst mild violence, and in many cases, just very pacific, normal life. But the simple thing is there's no news program that says, oh, well, it's another year of peace and stability in Botswana, which they've had since independence. And so, simply put, on the one hand, these depictions, while they are very much based on and very much fit the pattern of events that have happened on the continent, they are by far the exception, just they're not necessarily reported that way.
Yeah.
I consider it a serious problem. It would be easy for people to assume that I ordered this attack.
Look at their gear, look at their car. Jesus, that is the highest quality.
Another soldier for hire. What is a going rate for mercenaries these days? We fight for the FLN. You'll call me Dr. Kakumba.
How you get across border? Nobody can come into country these days.
Tell him.
There's a special forces outfit in area, just gun for hire guys, but they are armed to the teeth. They are paid to parachute in and grab someone.
He doesn't need to know who.
It's okay if he knows. They're here for a big shot from the APR, but if they take our enemy, we got nobody to fight.
Just get to the point.
The SF team is set up in good position in the desert, 2 kilometers to southeast. Kakumba here doesn't want anybody to think he planned secret rendition, would make him look bad.
Enough, please. All you have to do is to find these men and destroy their vehicles.
The gear in their vehicles, radios, water, canteens, ammo, all the gear they dropped in.
This is our struggle. Africa is for Africans. We do not need outside involvement. I expect you to stop these men. Job is yours.
Standby point is in southern desert. Find the team and destroy their gear. Then they are nice and screwed. Payments here.
So the next question comes in from one of our Patreon patrons. This patron is David Schroeder. And he asked the following. How much were African post-colonial conflicts, like the one depicted in Far Cry 2, influenced by Cold War ideologies? And were these ideologies more important than pre-existing ethno-cultural divides?
What I would say is that while Africans, especially in post-colonial and specifically in and then eventually into post-Cold War, were aware of the Cold War ideologies, they, I would say, rarely penetrated beyond a very sort of elite class, either leaders of countries or leaders of opposition. And oftentimes these, well, there's a very, very genuine question that can be posed of how genuine were these ideologies held. Actually watched the History Respawn on the Call of Duty Black Ops 1 and 2 and the discussion of Jonas Savimbi, and I think this is actually a really, really good example here, where you have this sort of elite figure who's very well educated and who's very well aware of these ideologies, but who finds himself a very changeable figure. He describes himself as a Marxist and as a Maoist, but very quickly is happy to play the role of the Christian doctor fighting for the freedom of his people against the Marxists when it serves kind of a cynical purpose of getting outside aid. And so what we often see, especially during the Cold War, is these sort of African elites kind of cynically deploying ideologies for basically favor or aid, economic or military, during the Cold War itself. Actually, what we end up seeing is with the end of the Cold War, and it's in the post-Cold War moment that we see a lot of these more chaotic conflicts sort of erupt, is we actually see, if not an abandonment of them, at least sort of an abandonment of the pretense that they're sort of genuinely held. Angola, which has been a Marxist country under the MPLA this entire time, just sort of shrugs its shoulders and continues saying we're a Marxist country as they really enter the global oil market. And these often become much more signifiers. You have the ANC in South Africa, which has sort of a Marxist roots and is happy to kind of hold on to that, but really uses it more as a signification that they are a revolutionary group that has fought for their freedom, that they fought against this sort of conservative apartheid South African government. And honestly, the reason I keep kind of harping on how these are sort of an elite project, we rarely see them really filter down past that. You'll see rhetoric, you'll see discussions during the Cold War, but outside of a few very individual examples, it really seems like ideology is not necessarily what's holding these groups together. Even in the more ardent groups, such as the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which takes on a sort of Maoist cast at times, you rarely see people really arguing that this is about kind of a worldwide socialist revolution. This is about a free Eritrea, because that's sort of the easiest message to mobilize people around. But on the other hand, in the absence of these ideologies, what often binds these groups together ultimately really is this ethnocultural identities. In Liberia, it's often these groups that are outgroups from power structures. The Americo-Liberians were the descendants of American slaves who moved over to Liberia and became sort of the ruling power structure. pretty much throughout their history from the 1830s to the 1990s, and some would argue continue to be. It's these specific sort of hinterland groups that have been kept out of the development and out of the power structure, that have sort of this shared identity and grievance that really form initial armed groups that spark off these civil wars, and it's kind of what helps keep them together.
Interesting.
Okay, sir, we are here. We made it alive. Hey, are you okay? You don't look so good. You tired?
Well, Far Cry 2 is famous for forcing players to deal with numerous environmental obstacles, including elements like rain and fire, as well as diseases like malaria. You also have to deal with weapons jams which occur with enemy weapons and high-use weapons alike. Can you give us a sense of the importance of environmental obstacles in African conflicts, and also maybe spend some time talking about the importance of diseases as well with regard to African conflicts in the past?
One of the many reasons, but definitely one of the prime ones, why colonization takes longer to really get rolling in Africa is actually the environmental difficulty, in particular diseases. Diseases like malaria, trypanosomiasis, cholera, and the like actually take a huge toll on European visitors into Africa to begin with. It's seen initially as a very pestilential place, and it's not really until the discovery of quinine and its role in suppressing malaria or preventing malaria that we really see deep penetration by Europeans into large parts of the continent. Part of the reason that you see, for example, South Africa colonized as early as the 1600s, and yet we don't see, say, for example, the Belgian Congo until the 1870s, is because South Africa is in a temperate zone. It is not a malarial zone because of that. There's not the insects. There's not necessarily the disease itself. And so Europeans who are very susceptible to this disease can survive there and live there for quite easily. Once you begin moving more towards kind of the Central Africa, suddenly at least the disease vectors become much more manifold and cause much greater difficulties, and not just simply for Europeans, but also trypanosomiasis and the like carried by the tsetse fly just takes a horrific toll on pack animals like donkeys, like oxen, like horses. And so what's often seen as kind of force multipliers for the transport of European goods, services, and just people are ground to a halt. And so this very much slows down colonization. Now, it doesn't stop it. As medicine sort of moves along, they're able to kind of deal with this more often. There's never really an easy solution for livestock and the like in Central Africa, but people, thanks to anti-malarials like you see in the game, can survive there just fine as long as they take them. Whenever I go over, I take Malarone every day. Now, it's interesting, though, because then this creates a very, very, very unique dynamic within conflicts. Number one, most cavalry just doesn't exist in East and Central Africa. In some areas of the Horn, where the elevation's high enough, the tsetse fly doesn't exist, so you can have that. But during the First World War, when they tried deploying South African cavalry to Tanganyika, now Tanzania, they lose all of their horses very, very quickly. Beyond that, even with things like anti-malarials, just the amount of diseases that the Europeans are not prepared for just causes massive, massive attrition. So one of the English units, the 25th Royal Fusiliers, if I remember correctly, loses something like 80% of their strength within the first year, and most of those are not battle casualties. That's just attrition. And in many cases, many of the men that then actually subsequently recover don't recover enough to then take part in the fighting again. This, of course, also is exacerbated often by inadequate infrastructure, to where, say, a war in Western Europe, you've got well-traveled roads, you've got, in many cases, rail lines, you've got canals and all that. Those simply don't, in many cases, exist in parts of Africa. This is part of the larger underdevelopment of the continent during the colonial era. What large-scale roads and rail lines don't exist to connect areas within the continent. They exist to connect areas in the continent to ports on the coast for the extraction and exportation of commodities.
Right.
And so the environment between diseases, between actual infrastructure, really both makes large-scale conflict very difficult to coordinate and wage, but also means that in many cases the most lethal part of the conflict is the environment itself. And I don't mean that in some sort of, there's a wild kingdom and lions are going to get you. I mean that the thing is there's large areas where there is not necessarily a lot of food and potable water, where there are disease vectors and the like, to where even in the present day, during the Second Congo War, which ran from 1998 to 2003, we see a massive death toll. There's current arguments placing it anywhere between 2.6 and 5.4 million dead. That's million with an M. And I realize that's a wide variance. There's a variety of reasons for that. But out of those, less than 1 million of those deaths are considered violent deaths in combat. That means you're talking 1.6 million to approximately 4.4 million are mostly dead from malnutrition and diseases, because they are most of the time displaced persons who have been forced out of their homes into inhospitable environments.
Right. Wow. Yeah. One of the remarkable things about this game, and maybe we can use this to lead into the next question, is the fact that there isn't much in the game setting, besides mercenaries and the factions. So I'm thinking in particular the fact that there are no civilians in this game. Now, there's kind of consistent reference made to displaced people. There's a mechanic in the game where you can help religious leaders, doctors, with aiding these displaced people in return for malarial medicine. But remarkably, you never really run into civilians, never worry have to fighting civilians or avoiding fighting civilians or shooting civilians. And I'm just wondering, can you give us a sense of the importance of the issue of displaced people, of refugees in post-colonial wars in Africa?
Oh, goodness, yes. I would say, and this is, again, solely my own opinion, but the issue of displaced persons is the central issue of all of these conflicts, of every single one of them. Whether it is the creation of massive death tolls as they're fleeing war zones, like we just talked about in the Congo War, and these are mostly innocent people. These are the elderly. These are women. These are children. These are folks with disabilities that cannot be necessarily drafted into a fight, or sometimes just people that just, this is not their war. The other piece out of this is these populations often then become the engines for the next conflict. So, for example, during the Rwandan genocide, for example, Hutu-led government that begins the genocide. 800,000 are killed in a very short amount of time. In response, a Tutsi-led force, a guerrilla force that's been mostly based in Uganda, pushes into the country and forces them out. This is the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which is now the official government of Rwanda. But the thing is there's a large group of Hutus who many have not taken part in the genocide, many perhaps are genocide adjacent, and some have taken part. But all of them are now fleeing Rwanda in fear of reprisals from the RPF government that's coming. Those populations, both those who had been genocidaires and then those who are simply afraid of being labeled genocidaires, then are displaced into the eastern Congo, into a variety of refugee camps that are really badly taken care of, and then in many cases badly taken advantage of. You have military leaders, and this is chronicled largely in Jason Stearns' book Dancing in the Glory of Monsters, which is just fantastic, where you have former military leaders really kind of upping the population counts in these camps so that they can get additional food and resources. You have folks who originally had not necessarily been involved in any of the political radicalization, but who have now been forced out of out of what they see as their home and seeing themselves lose property, and who now do get involved. And this ends up with these groups then, in many cases, forming their own strong insurgency, who then begin raiding into Rwanda, which then provokes a Rwandan response to go after those militants in the camps.
Right.
And this then kicks off the Congo Wars. And so these displaced persons, both are often the source of the vast majority of the, in many cases, innocent deaths in these conflicts. They then also then become the epicenter for the next round of violence.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. That does it for today's episode. Charlie, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Oh, this was an incredible pleasure. I can only hope that at some point someone makes another video game with Africa as a setting and I can join you again.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to that. And my thanks also go out to our patrons on Patreon, who continue to support History Respawned. If you enjoy our work here at History Respawned and are interested in supporting us, please go to www.patreon.com/History Respawned. That's all for today's episode. Until next time, goodbye.